The wind howled like a wounded animal as Adelaide Evans urged her horse forward through the narrow mountain pass. Her fingers numb even through her leather gloves as snow began to fall in thick, wet clumps that clung to her eyelashes and obscured her vision. She had been a fool to leave Central City, Colorado, so late in the afternoon, but the telegram about her sister's illness in Denver had sent her racing from the small mining town without proper preparation. And now, the November storm of 1878 was closing in around her like a frozen fist determined to squeeze the life from her bones. The horse stumbled on the icy rocks beneath the rapidly accumulating snow, and Adelaide felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized the terrible truth that she was not going to make it through the pass before the storm made travel completely impossible. Her mare, a sturdy chestnut named Daisy, whinnied nervously as the wind picked up even more, sending swirling columns of snow dancing across the narrow trail that wound between towering rock faces on either side. Adelaide had traveled this route twice before, always in summer when the wildflowers bloomed along the edges and the sky stretched blue and endless overhead. But winter had transformed it into something alien and terrifying. She could barely see 10 feet ahead through the white curtain that nature had drawn across the world, and every instinct screamed at her to find shelter immediately. "Easy, girl," Adelaide called to her horse, though her voice was nearly lost in the roar of wind. "We will find somewhere to wait this out." But even as she spoke, she knew the odds were against them. The pass stretched for another 3 miles before descending into the valley on the other side, and there were no cabins or caves that she knew of along this particular stretch. The mining camps were all lower down the mountain, and the nearest ranch was at least 5 miles beyond the far end of the pass. Adelaide had grown up on the frontier, had learned to shoot and ride before she turned 10, but she had also learned to respect the power of nature, and this storm was quickly becoming a killer. Her father had died 2 years ago in a mining accident, leaving Adelaide to run the small boarding house he had built in Central City. At 23, she had become accustomed to managing on her own, to making difficult decisions and living with the consequences, but this was different. This was nature in its rawest form, indifferent to human will or determination. The horse stumbled again, more severely this time, and Adelaide felt herself sliding sideways in the saddle. She grabbed for the horn, but her numb fingers could not grip properly, and suddenly she was falling, hitting the ground hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. Pain shot through her left ankle and she cried out, the sound swallowed immediately by the storm. Daisy bolted, disappearing into the white wall of snow, and Adelaide felt the first real tendrils of panic wrapping around her heart. "No, Daisy, come back." She tried to stand, but her ankle gave way beneath her weight, sending fresh waves of agony up her leg. Crawling forward on hands and knees, Adelaide peered through the storm in the direction her horse had fled, but there was nothing to see except endless white. The snow was already covering the tracks, erasing all evidence that the mare had ever existed. Adelaide forced herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly despite the cold that was seeping through her wool coat and the fear that threatened to overwhelm her rational mind. She could not stay here in the open. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the snow was falling so thickly now that she could barely see her own hands when she held them up before her face. She needed to find shelter, even if it was just a rocky overhang or a cluster of boulders that would break the wind. Using her hands and her good leg, Adelaide began to drag herself toward the rock face on her right, hoping to at least get out of the direct path of the wind. Every movement sent pain shooting through her injured ankle, but she gritted her teeth and continued, knowing that stopping meant death. The snow was so deep already that her hands disappeared into it with each movement forward, and she could feel the wet cold soaking through her clothes, stealing her body heat with ruthless efficiency. She had made it perhaps 20 feet when her hand struck something other than snow or rock. Wood. Adelaide cleared away the snow with increasingly clumsy movements and discovered what looked like an old wooden crate, partially buried and weathered by time. It was not much, but it suggested that someone had been this way before, that perhaps there was more to find. Encouraged, she continued along the rock face, searching with her hands since her eyes were nearly useless in the whiteout conditions. Then her hand went through empty space instead of striking solid rock, and Adelaide nearly fell forward into the darkness. A cave. It was small, barely more than a crack in the mountain, but it went back far enough to offer protection from the wind and snow. Using the last of her strength, Adelaide dragged herself inside, collapsing onto the rocky floor as soon as she was far enough in to be out of the weather. For several minutes she simply lay there, gasping for breath, her entire body shaking violently from cold and shock. Her ankle throbbed with a deep, pulsing pain that suggested she had done more than simply twist it, and when she carefully probed the joint through her boot, she had to bite back a cry. Swollen, possibly broken, definitely unable to bear her weight. Even if the storm passed quickly, she was not going to be walking out of these mountains. Adelaide forced herself to sit up, to take stock of her situation with the practical mind that had helped her survive the last 2 years alone. The cave protected her from the wind and snow, which was good, but it was still bitterly cold and she was already soaked through. She had no dry wood for a fire, no food, and only the knife at her belt for tools. Her saddlebags with her supplies were gone with Daisy, and even if she could somehow start a fire, the smoke might not draw help in these conditions. The logical part of her brain calculated her chances and found them wanting. Without warmth, without the ability to walk, she would likely not survive the night. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and even if it did, who would be out looking for travelers in a mountain pass in November? Adelaide had not told anyone which route she was taking to Denver, had not thought to leave word because she had made this journey before without incident. She was going to die here, alone in the darkness, and they would not find her body until spring. The thought filled her with a strange calm. She had always known that life on the frontier was dangerous, that death could come suddenly and without warning. Her mother had died of fever when Adelaide was 12, her father crushed under tons of rock at 45. At least her sister would eventually learn what had happened, would understand that Adelaide had been trying to reach her when the storm hit. Adelaide pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them in a futile attempt to conserve body heat. Her shaking had intensified, and she knew that was a bad sign, knew that her body was losing the battle against the cold. Already her fingers and toes had gone past pain into a numbness that was somehow worse, and her thoughts were beginning to feel sluggish and disconnected. She might have dozed off, or perhaps lost consciousness briefly, because the next thing she was aware of was a sound cutting through the howl of the storm. A voice, deep and male, calling out something she could not quite make out. Adelaide tried to respond, but her lips would not form the words properly, and the sound that emerged from her throat was barely a whimper. The voice came again, closer this time, and then a massive shape appeared at the mouth of the cave, blocking out what little light penetrated the storm. Adelaide tried to focus, but her eyes refused to cooperate, showing her only a dark silhouette that seemed impossibly tall and broad. "Jesus Christ," the shape said, and the voice was rough like gravel but somehow warm, somehow alive in a way that cut through her growing numbness. "Hold on, I have got you now," Strong hands touched her face, her neck, and Adelaide felt herself being lifted as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. She tried to speak, to ask who he was or where he was taking her, but the words tangled in her mouth and came out as meaningless sounds. The last thing she registered before darkness claimed her completely was warmth, blessed warmth, and the steady rhythm of a heartbeat against her cheek. When Adelaide woke, her first thought was that she had died and gone to some afterlife she had not expected. She was warm, genuinely warm, for the first time in what felt like forever, and she was lying on something soft that smelled of pine and wood smoke. Firelight danced across rough wooden walls, and she could hear the storm still raging outside, but the sound was muffled, distant, no longer an immediate threat. She turned her head slowly, her body feeling strange and heavy, and saw a man crouched by a stone fireplace, adding wood to flames that crackled and popped. He was enormous, easily over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the small space. His hair was dark and thick, falling past his collar in waves that looked like they had been cut with a knife rather than scissors. When he turned to look at her, Adelaide found herself staring into eyes the color of storm clouds, set in a face that was all hard angles and weathered skin. "You are awake," he said, setting down the wood and moving toward her with surprising grace for someone so large. "How do you feel?" Adelaide opened her mouth to respond, but her throat was so dry that she could only manage a croak. The man immediately reached for a tin cup sitting near the fire, tested its temperature with his finger, then brought it to her. "Drink slowly," he instructed, sliding one massive hand behind her shoulders to help her sit up enough to sip from the cup. "Your body needs to warm up gradually." The liquid was broth, rich and salty, and Adelaide had never tasted anything so wonderful in her entire life. She drank carefully, aware of his hand supporting her, aware of how close he was and how completely she was at his mercy. But there was nothing threatening in his manner, nothing that suggested she should fear him despite his size and the isolation of their situation. "Where am I?" she finally managed to ask, her voice still rough but functional. "My cabin," he replied, gently lowering her back down onto what she now realized was a bed piled with furs and blankets. "About half a mile from where I found you in that cave. I was checking my trap line when the storm hit, heading for home when I heard your horse. Found her tangled in some brush, brought her here, then went back to look for her rider." "Daisy," Adelaide said, relief flooding through her. "She is all right, scared but unharmed. She is in the lean-to with my mule out of the storm." He studied her face with an intensity that made her feel strangely exposed. "Your ankle is badly sprained, possibly broken. I wrapped it while you were unconscious, but you are going to need to stay off it for several weeks at minimum." Adelaide processed this information, understanding what it meant even through the lingering fog in her mind. She could not travel, could not even walk, which meant she was stranded here with this stranger for the foreseeable future. The thought should have frightened her, but somehow it did not. "I am Adelaide Evans," she said, partly because it seemed important to establish her identity, to remind both of them that she was a person with a life beyond this cabin. "I run a boarding house in Central City. I was trying to reach Denver when the storm caught me." "Kane Zimmerman," he replied, settling into a chair near the fire that looked like it had been built to accommodate his considerable size. "I trap these mountains in winter, pan for gold in summer. Been living up here about 5 years now." 5 years. Adelaide tried to imagine spending 5 years alone in these mountains, with only brief trips to town for supplies breaking the endless cycle of solitude. What kind of man chose such a life? She studied him more carefully, noting the way his rough wool shirt strained across muscles that spoke of hard physical labor, The way his hands rested easily on his knees, scarred and calloused, but somehow gentle despite their size. "How long was I unconscious?" she asked. "Most of the night." "It is near dawn now, though you would not know it with the storm still going." Kane stood and moved to a small window, peering out at the white chaos beyond the glass. "This is going to blow for another day at least, maybe two. Even when it clears, the pass will be blocked for weeks." "I have to get to Denver," Adelaide protested, trying to sit up despite the way her head spun with the movement. "My sister is ill. She needs me." "Your sister needs you alive," Kane said, his voice firm but not unkind. "If you had spent another hour in that cave, you would be dead. As it is, you came close to losing fingers and toes to frostbite. You are staying here until you can travel safely, and that means until your ankle heals and the weather clears." Adelaide wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she would be fine, but the truth was undeniable. She was completely dependent on this stranger, this mountain man who had pulled her from the edge of death and brought her to his home. The reality of her situation settled over her like a weight, and she felt tears pricking at her eyes despite her determination not to show weakness. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I was foolish to travel alone in November. I know better, but the telegram said my sister was asking for me, and I just left without thinking properly." Kane's expression softened slightly, and he returned to his chair by the fire. "Fear makes fools of us all sometimes. What matters is that you survived and that you will heal. Your sister will understand." "You do not know that," Adelaide said, but there was no heat in her words. "She might not. She might die thinking I abandoned her." "Then we will find a way to get word to her," Kane replied. "Once the storm breaks, I can ride down to Central City, send a telegram from there. It is not perfect, but it is better than nothing." The kindness in his offer made Adelaide's throat tighten, and she blinked rapidly to clear her vision. She was not accustomed to accepting help from others, had spent the last 2 years proving that she could manage alone, but she had no choice now. She was helpless, and he was her only hope of survival. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. For finding me, for bringing me here, for saving my life." Kane shrugged, looking almost uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Any decent person would have done the same." "But you are the one who did it," Adelaide persisted. "You could have stayed safe in your cabin instead of going back out into the storm to look for a stranger. Could not leave someone to die if there was a chance of helping," he said simply. And Adelaide understood that this was as much of his philosophy as he was going to share. He was a man of action rather than words, someone who did what needed to be done without expectation of praise or reward. The silence stretched between them, not quite comfortable but not hostile either, filled with the crackle of the fire and the howl of wind outside. Adelaide found her eyes growing heavy again despite having just woken, and she realized that her body was still recovering from its ordeal, still desperately in need of rest. "Sleep," Kane said, as if reading her thoughts. "I will keep the fire going, make sure you stay warm. Everything else can wait." Adelaide wanted to protest that she had already been enough trouble, that she should not impose further, but exhaustion pulled at her with irresistible force. Her eyes drifted closed, and she felt herself sliding back into darkness. But this time, it was the peaceful darkness of healing sleep, rather than the cold void that had nearly claimed her in the cave. When she woke again, pale light was filtering through the cabin's single window, suggesting that day had come even if the sun was hidden behind the storm clouds. The fire still crackled in the hearth, and Adelaide could smell something cooking that made her stomach clench with sudden fierce hunger. She turned her head and saw Kane at a small table, carefully slicing what looked like venison into a pot suspended over the coals. "That smells wonderful," she said, and he glanced over his shoulder at her. "Elk stew," he said. "Nothing fancy, but it is hot and filling. Think you can sit up to eat?" Adelaide experimentally pushed herself into a sitting position, biting her lip against the dizziness that washed over her. Her ankle throbbed dully, a constant ache that she was going to have to learn to live with for the next few weeks, but the rest of her body felt surprisingly functional given what she had been through. "I can manage," she said, and Kane brought over a bowl of stew along with a chunk of bread that looked homemade. "Eat slowly," he advised. "Your stomach might not be ready for much yet." He was right. Adelaide managed perhaps a third of the bowl before her stomach protested, but even that small amount made her feel more human, more present in her own skin. Kane ate his own meal in silence, his eyes occasionally straying to the window where snow continued to fall in thick curtains that blocked any view of the surrounding landscape. "How bad is it?" Adelaide asked, following his gaze. "Bad enough. Must be 3 feet accumulated already, and it shows no sign of stopping. I have seen storms like this before. They can dump 6 or 7 feet before they blow themselves out." He set down his empty bowl. "We have supplies to last several weeks, longer if we are careful. Plenty of meat, flour, coffee, dried beans. You will not starve." "What about you?" Adelaide asked. "Were you prepared for an extra mouth to feed?" Kane's lips quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "I always lay in more supplies than I think I will need. Learned that lesson my first winter up here when I ran short and had to eat nothing but rabbit for 2 months straight." Adelaide found herself smiling back, surprised by the hint of humor in his voice. "That sounds unpleasant." "You have no idea," he said. Could not look at rabbit for a year after that without feeling sick. The conversation felt almost normal, like something that might happen between neighbors or friends rather than strangers thrown together by circumstances. Adelaide felt some of the tension she had been carrying ease slightly, though she was still acutely aware of the strangeness of her situation. She was alone in a remote mountain cabin with a man she had known for less than a day, completely dependent on him for survival, unable to even stand on her own. "I should probably explain," she said carefully, "that I am not typically helpless. I can shoot, ride, manage accounts, cook for 20 people at a time. I am not expecting you to wait on me like I am some kind of invalid." Kane regarded her steadily. "Right now, you are injured and recovering. That is not helplessness, it is just reality. When you are stronger, I am sure you will pull your own weight. Until then, let yourself heal without worrying about what you think you should be doing." The understanding in his voice caught Adelaide off guard, and she felt that uncomfortable prickling behind her eyes again. She had been so determined to prove her independence after her father died, to show the world that she did not need anyone's help or pity, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone simply accept her limitations without judgment. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you." The days that followed developed a strange rhythm of their own. The storm continued for 3 full days, burying the cabin in snow that drifted halfway up the walls in places. Kane went out periodically to check on the animals and to dig out the door, returning each time covered in snow and half frozen despite his heavy coat. Adelaide watched from the bed, frustrated by her inability to help, but gradually her ankle began to hurt less, and her strength started to return. Kane was not much of a talker, but his presence was oddly comforting. He moved around the small cabin with the efficiency of someone who had lived alone for years, never wasting motion, always seeming to know exactly where everything was. He cooked simple but satisfying meals, kept the fire burning steadily, and checked Adelaide's ankle twice daily to monitor its healing. On the 4th day, Adelaide woke to silence. The absence of wind howling around the cabin was so profound that for a moment she thought something was wrong, but then she realized what it meant. The storm had finally passed. She sat up carefully, swinging her legs over the edge of the bed, and saw Kane already up and looking out the window. "How does it look?" she asked. He turned to face her, and his expression was serious. "We got 6 feet, maybe more in the drifts. It is clear now, sky like blue glass, but it will be weeks before the pass is usable. Even getting down to Central City is going to be challenging until the snow settles and a path gets broken." Adelaide had expected this, but hearing it confirmed still sent a pang of worry through her. "So I am stuck here." "We are both stuck here," Kane corrected. "But there are worse places to be stuck." He moved away from the window and crouched down in front of her. "Let me look at your ankle." Adelaide extended her leg, watching as he carefully unwrapped the bandages he had applied days ago. The swelling had gone down considerably, and the bruising that covered her ankle and foot had faded from purple-black to greenish-yellow. Kane probed the joint gently with his fingers, and while it still hurt, it was nothing like the agony of those first days. "It is healing well," he said. "Not broken, which is good news. Probably another week before you can put weight on it, but you should be able to move around more now as long as you are careful." "I am going insane lying in that bed," Adelaide admitted. "I am not used to being idle." Kane straightened up, and Adelaide was once again struck by his sheer size. He had to duck slightly to avoid hitting his head on the roof beams, and his shoulders seemed to fill the entire space. But there was nothing threatening about his bulk. If anything, it made her feel safe, protected, like nothing could possibly harm her while he was there. "Can you fashion me a crutch or something?" she asked. "Even just being able to sit by the fire would be an improvement." "I can do better than that," Kane said. He disappeared into a corner of the cabin and returned with a length of wood that he had clearly been working on, carving and smoothing it during the quiet hours. "I started making this yesterday. Just needs a bit more work to get it to the right height for you." Adelaide stared at the emerging crutch, touched by his thoughtfulness. "You did not have to do that. Figured you would be climbing the walls soon enough," he said with that faint hint of a smile. "Give me an hour and it will be ready." True to his word, Kane finished the crutch and helped Adelaide to her feet, supporting her weight as she tested it out. The first few steps were awkward and painful, but the relief of being upright, of being able to move under her own power, was immense. She made her way slowly to the chair by the fire and sank into it with a sigh of satisfaction. "This is wonderful," she said. "Thank you." Kane just nodded and went back to his work, which seemed to involve checking over his traps and equipment, preparing for whenever he could get out into the snow again. Adelaide watched him, fascinated by the economical way he moved, the casual competence with which he handled tools and materials. His hands were huge but surprisingly deft, and she found herself wondering what his story was, what had brought him to live alone in these mountains. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a while. He glanced up from the trap he was repairing. "You can ask. No guarantee I will answer." "Why did you come up here? To live alone like this?" Kane was silent for so long that Adelaide thought he was not going to respond, but finally he set down his tools and looked at her. "I was a soldier during the war, fought for the Union in some of the worst battles you can imagine. When it was over, I could not go back to regular life, could not stand being around people, all that noise and chaos. I headed west, tried working in the mines for a while, but it was the same problem. Too many people, too much everything." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "One day I just kept walking up into the mountains and I found this place. Built the cabin with my own hands, learned to trap and hunt and survive on my own terms. Up here, it is quiet, peaceful. The only violence is what nature dishes out, and at least that is honest. Adelaide absorbed this, understanding dawning. You have seen too much ugliness in humanity. Something like that. Kane picked up his trap again but did not resume working on it. What about you? Why is a woman running a boarding house alone in a mining town? My father built it after my mother died, Adelaide explained. He wanted to provide for me, make sure I would have some way to support myself. When he died in the mine collapse 2 years ago, it became mine. I thought about selling it, moving back east to live with my sister and her husband, but I could not do it. That boarding house represents everything my father worked for, everything he wanted for me. Giving it up felt like betraying his memory. So you stayed and ran it yourself, Kane said. That takes courage. Or stubbornness, Adelaide said with a small laugh. Some days I am not sure which. Maybe both, Kane suggested. Nothing wrong with being stubborn when it is in service of something worthwhile. Their eyes met across the small space of the cabin, and Adelaide felt something shift between them, some invisible wall beginning to crumble. They were not just strangers thrown together by circumstance anymore. They were two people who had both survived loss and hardship, who had both chosen difficult paths because the alternatives were unthinkable. The days began to pass more quickly after that. Adelaide grew stronger, more mobile, and insisted on helping with tasks around the cabin despite Kane's protests that she should rest. She could not hunt or tend the animals, but she could cook and mend and keep the fire going, and it felt good to be useful again. They fell into an easy partnership, moving around each other in the confined space with a growing familiarity that felt natural rather than awkward. In the evenings, after the work was done and they had eaten, they would sit by the fire and talk. Kane was not much for long speeches, but he would answer Adelaide's questions about life in the mountains, about the animals and plants, about the changing seasons and the challenges each brought. In turn, Adelaide told him about Central City, about the miners and merchants who stayed at her boarding house, about the wild mix of humanity that populated the Colorado frontier. You ever get lonely up here? Adelaide asked one night, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. Kane considered the question carefully. Sometimes, mostly in the dead of winter when the storms are bad and I have not seen another soul in weeks, but it is a different kind of loneliness than what I felt in the war, surrounded by thousands of men. That was worse somehow, being lonely in a crowd. I think I understand that, Adelaide said softly. I am surrounded by people every day at the boarding house, but I still go to bed alone every night feeling like something is missing. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Adelaide felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. There was something in his eyes, some hunger or longing that she recognized because she felt it too. The awareness of it hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. Adelaide, Kane said, his voice rough, and the way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine. Yes, he opened his mouth as if to say something, then seemed to think better of it and shook his head. Nothing. It is getting late, we should sleep. Adelaide wanted to push, to ask what he had been about to say, but something in his expression stopped her. Instead, she simply nodded and made her way to the bed on her crutch while Kane spread his bedroll by the fire as he had every night since she arrived. But sleep was slow in coming. Adelaide lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of Kane's breathing across the cabin, and wondered what was happening between them. She had known him for barely 2 weeks, and yet she felt more comfortable with him, more herself, than she had with anyone since her father died. Was it just gratitude, the natural result of being dependent on someone for survival? Or was it something deeper, something real that had nothing to do with circumstance and everything to do with the man himself? The next morning dawned clear and cold, and Kane announced that he needed to check his trap line, something he had not been able to do properly since before the storm. Adelaide insisted she would be fine alone for a few hours, and after extracting a promise that she would stay off her ankle as much as possible, Kane bundled himself up and headed out into the snow on snowshoes he had made himself. Alone in the cabin, Adelaide found herself at loose ends. She tidied things that did not need tidying, checked the stew that was simmering over the fire, and finally settled into the chair with some mending that Kane had mentioned needed doing. But her mind was not on the work. Instead, she found herself thinking about Kane, about the way his rare smiles transformed his harsh features, about the gentleness in his massive hands when he checked her ankle, about the way she felt safe and protected in his presence. She was falling in love with him. The realization came not as a shock but as a quiet certainty, like something she had known all along but had not wanted to acknowledge. It was foolish, impractical, probably doomed to end badly, but it was true nonetheless. Somewhere in these weeks of forced proximity, somewhere between his rescuing her from the storm and his patient care as she healed, she had given him her heart without even realizing it. The question was what to do about it. Kane had given no clear indication of his feelings beyond basic kindness and friendship. He might see her as nothing more than an obligation, someone he had to care for until she could return to her own life. The thought of declaring her feelings only to have him reject her gently but firmly made her stomach clench with anticipated humiliation. She was still wrestling with these thoughts when Kane returned several hours later, his face reddened by the cold but his eyes bright. He carried several rabbits and what looked like a fox, evidence of a successful morning on the trap line. "Good haul," Adelaide said, forcing her voice to sound normal despite her inner turmoil. "Best in weeks," Kane agreed, beginning the process of skinning and cleaning his catch with practiced efficiency. "The storm must have pushed them into patterns where my traps were set. This should give us plenty of meat for a while, plus the pelts will bring good money when I can get them to a trading post." Adelaide watched him work, watched the play of muscles beneath his shirt, the concentration on his face, the casual competence with which he handled the knife. Everything about him spoke of strength and capability, of a man who could survive anything the wilderness threw at him. But there was gentleness, too, a core of decency that he tried to hide but that showed through in everything he did. "Kane," she said before she could lose her nerve, "can I ask you something?" "Sure," he said without looking up from his work. "Why have you never married, settled down with someone?" His hand stilled on the knife, and for a long moment he was completely motionless. Then he resumed his work, but slower now, more deliberate. "Never found the right woman, I suppose, and my life up here is not exactly suited to family life. What woman would want to be isolated in the mountains for months at a time, cut off from society and civilization? Maybe a woman who valued peace and safety over society," Adelaide suggested quietly. "A woman who had seen enough of civilization to know it is not all it is made out to be." Kane looked up at her then, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch. "Why are you asking me this, Adelaide?" This was it. The moment where she either found the courage to be honest or backed away into safe silence. Adelaide thought of her father, of his courage in starting over after her mother died, of how he had always told her that fortune favored the bold. She thought of the past 2 years of careful, controlled loneliness, of going through the motions of life without really living. "Because I need to know if I am alone in what I am feeling," she said, her heart hammering so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "These past weeks with you, I have felt more alive, more myself than I have in years. I know it is probably just circumstance, just proximity and gratitude mixed up together. But I need to know if there is any chance that you might feel something too." Kane set down his knife very carefully and stood, crossing the small space between them in 2 long strides. He stopped in front of her chair, so close that Adelaide had to tilt her head back to look up at him. His face was serious, almost stern, but his eyes held that same hunger she had seen before. "It is not circumstance," he said, his voice low and rough. "It is not gratitude or proximity or anything else that simple. From the moment you woke up in my bed and looked at me like I was a person instead of a monster, I have been fighting against what I am feeling. You are educated, refined, used to running your own business and making your own choices. I am a hermit who lives in a cabin in the mountains and talks to his mule. You deserve better than what I could offer you." "Should not I be the one to decide what I deserve?" Adelaide asked, reaching up to take his hand in hers. His fingers engulfed hers completely, rough and scarred but so very warm. "I do not need refinement or society, Kane. I need honesty and kindness and someone who sees me as I really am. I need you." For a moment he just stood there, conflict clear on his face, and Adelaide thought he was going to pull away, to retreat into the safety of distance and denial. But then something shifted, some final wall crumbling, and he dropped to his knees beside her chair so that they were at eye level. "I am not good at pretty words," he said, bringing his free hand up to cup her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from such a large, rough man. "I cannot promise you luxury or comfort or any of the things a woman is supposed to want. But I can promise that I will keep you safe, that I will never hurt you, that I will spend every day trying to be worthy of what you are offering me." "Kane," Adelaide whispered, and then his lips were on hers, tentative at first, as if he was afraid of breaking her, but growing more confident when she responded with equal passion. The kiss was nothing like the chaste pecks she had exchanged with suitors back when she was younger. This was raw and hungry and real, full of weeks of denied wanting and the joy of finally being able to express it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Adelaide found herself laughing with pure happiness. "I think that was pretty enough," she said. Kane smiled then, a real smile that transformed his entire face, making him look younger and more carefree than she had ever seen him. "Stay with me," he said. "Not just until the snow clears, but for real. Stay here and be my wife and let me love you the way you deserve to be loved." "Yes," Adelaide said without hesitation. "Yes to all of it." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Adelaide felt like she was flying, like the joy bubbling up inside her could lift her right off the ground. She had come to these mountains expecting nothing but a journey to her sister's sick, and instead she had found something infinitely more precious. She had found home. She had found love. She had found the person who made her feel complete in a way she had not even known she was lacking. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Adelaide's life. Her ankle healed steadily, and as her mobility improved, she took over more and more of the household tasks, learning the rhythms of mountain life with Kane as her patient teacher. He showed her how to read the weather in the clouds, how to recognize animal tracks in the snow, how to move quietly through the forest and see things that most people would miss. In turn, Adelaide brought warmth and laughter to the cabin that had been missing for the 5 years Kane had lived there alone. She cooked meals that were more elaborate than his simple fare, taught him card games her father had favored, and filled the evenings with stories and conversation that chased away the winter darkness. And at night, after the fire burned low, they would lie together in the bed that had once been his alone, learning each other's bodies with the same patient care they brought to everything else. Kane was always gentle despite his size, always conscious of her healing ankle and her relative inexperience. And Adelaide fell more in love with him with each passing day. When the snow finally began to melt in early March, Kane made the journey down to Central City to send telegrams and collect Adelaide's things from the boarding house. He was gone for 3 days, and Adelaide found that she hated every moment of his absence, constantly worrying despite knowing he was more than capable of taking care of himself. When he finally returned, riding Daisy and leading his mule loaded with trunks and boxes, Adelaide flew out of the cabin and threw herself into his arms the moment he dismounted, not caring about propriety or dignity. "I missed you," she said against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of him. "I was only gone 3 days," he said, but his arms tightened around her, and she knew he had missed her just as much. "3 days too long," Adelaide said firmly. "I do not want to be apart from you again if we can help it." Kane pulled back enough to look down at her, his gray eyes serious. "Then you should know that I brought back a preacher. He is waiting down at the bottom of the trail. I thought, if you are still sure, we could make this official. Properly married before God and the law." Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears. "You brought a preacher all the way up here." "Had to promise him $50 and 3 months' worth of elk meat," Kane said with a hint of a smile. "But yes. If you still want to marry me, we can do it today." "I want to marry you today, tomorrow, every day for the rest of our lives," Adelaide said fiercely. "Go get that preacher before he changes his mind." The ceremony was simple, conducted in the clearing in front of the cabin with the mountains as witnesses, and the March sun shining down with unexpected warmth. The preacher was a round little man who clearly thought they were both insane for choosing to live in such isolation, but he performed the service with proper solemnity, and when he pronounced them man and wife, Adelaide felt like her heart might burst from happiness. After the preacher departed with his promised payment, Kane swept Adelaide up in his arms and carried her over the threshold of the cabin, despite her laughing protests that her ankle was healed, and she could walk perfectly well. "Humor me," he said, setting her down inside but keeping his arms around her. "I have been thinking about doing this since the day you said you would stay." "You are an incurable romantic," Adelaide teased, reaching up to run her fingers through his dark hair. "Only for you," Kane said, and kissed her with a thoroughness that suggested the rest of the day's work could wait. They settled into married life with the same ease that had characterized their courtship. Adelaide sold the boarding house to a couple from Denver who had been looking to invest in Central City, and the money gave them a comfortable cushion against lean times. She kept a few of her father's belongings, things that held sentimental value, but she found that she did not miss the busy chaos of running a boarding house. Her life with Kane was simpler but infinitely richer. As spring turned to summer, Kane taught Adelaide to pan for gold in the mountain streams, and they spent long sunny days working side by side, finding enough color to make the effort worthwhile, but never striking the kind of big find that would change their lives. Not that Adelaide wanted their lives to change. She was perfectly content with their small cabin, their simple routines, and the deep abiding love that grew stronger with each passing season. In August, Adelaide began to suspect that she was pregnant. She waited another month to be sure before telling Kane, choosing a night when they were sitting outside watching the stars wheel overhead in the impossibly clear mountain sky. "Kane," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach, "there is going to be 3 of us come spring." He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the starlight, and Adelaide felt a flutter of worry. They had not specifically discussed children, had not planned for this, and she suddenly wondered if he would welcome the news or see it as a complication to their peaceful life. Then a smile spread across his face, slow and wondering, and he pulled her into his arms with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes. "A baby," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Adelaide asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Kane said. "Terrified, amazed, grateful, all of that and more. You have given me so much already, Adelaide. A home, a purpose, a reason to be part of the world again. And now this." He placed his hand over hers on her stomach. "I did not think I deserved this kind of happiness." "We both deserve it," Adelaide said firmly. "After everything we have both survived and overcome, we deserve every bit of happiness we can find." Kane kissed her then, soft and sweet under the stars, and Adelaide knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Adelaide found that mountain life agreed with her even in her condition. Kane became even more protective than usual, insisting that she avoid anything strenuous and constantly worrying about her health. Adelaide bore his overprotectiveness with good humor, knowing it came from love rather than any belief that she was fragile. As winter approached again, they made preparations for the birth. Kane rode to Central City and brought back the midwife, a practical woman named Mrs. Cooper, who agreed to stay with them through the birth for a generous fee. She arrived in late February, just as the first labor pains began, and Adelaide was grateful for her calm presence as the hours stretched on. Kane paced outside the cabin like a caged animal, unable to settle, until Mrs. Cooper finally took pity on him and allowed him inside to hold Adelaide's hand. His presence steadied her, gave her something to focus on besides the pain, and when their son finally entered the world with a lusty cry, Adelaide saw tears streaming down Kane's weathered cheeks. "A boy, Mrs. Cooper announced, wrapping the baby in clean blankets and placing him in Adelaide's arms. "Strong and healthy, just like his father." Adelaide looked down at her son, at his red face and dark hair and tiny perfect fingers, and felt a love so overwhelming it was almost frightening in its intensity. This was her child, hers and Kane's, a new life that they had created together out of love and hope and the determination to build something good in a harsh world. "What should we name him?" Kane asked, his voice hushed with awe as he traced one massive finger down their son's tiny cheek. "Jacob," Adelaide said, thinking of her father's middle name. "Jacob Zimmerman." "Jacob," Kane repeated and smiled. "It is perfect." The years that followed were busy and full. Jacob grew into a strong, curious boy who loved the mountains as much as his father did. When he was 2, Adelaide gave birth to a daughter they named Emma, and 3 years after that, another son named Thomas. The cabin expanded as Kane added rooms to accommodate their growing family, and what had once been a hermit's lonely refuge became a home filled with laughter and love, and the cheerful chaos of children. Adelaide sometimes thought back to that November day when the storm had caught her in the pass, to how close she had come to dying alone in that cave. If the wind had been blowing differently, if Kane had chosen a different route back to his cabin, if any of a dozen small variables had been different, they never would have met. She would have frozen to death, and Kane would have continued his solitary existence, and their children never would have been born. But instead, the storm had brought them together, had given them both a second chance at life and love and happiness. Adelaide looked at her family, at Kane reading to Jacob and Emma while baby Thomas dozed in her arms, at the life they had built together in these mountains, and felt nothing but gratitude for the storm that had changed everything. "What are you thinking about?" Kane asked, glancing up from the book and catching her watching them. "Just how lucky we are," Adelaide said. "How lucky I am." Kane smiled, that rare, wonderful smile that still made her heart skip even after years of marriage. "I think we both got lucky that day I found you in the cave." "You saved my life," Adelaide reminded him. "And you saved mine right back," Kane said quietly. "I was not really living before you came, Adelaide. I was just existing, getting through one day after another. You taught me how to live again, how to love again, so I figure that makes us even." Adelaide looked at her husband, at the man who had pulled her from the edge of death and given her everything she had never known she wanted, and felt her eyes fill with happy tears. "We are more than even," she said. "We are blessed." As the children grew older, Adelaide and Kane made the decision to send them to school in Central City during the school year, staying in town with them in rooms above what had once been Adelaide's boarding house, now owned by friends who welcomed the arrangement. Summers were spent back in the mountains, where the children ran wild and free, learning the skills their father had to teach and growing strong in the clean mountain air. Jacob proved to have his father's quiet strength and his mother's practical intelligence, becoming a young man that any parent would be proud of. Emma was fierce and independent, equally comfortable hunting with her father or helping her mother in the kitchen. Thomas, the baby, had a gentle nature and a gift for music, spending hours playing the fiddle that Kane had bought him from a traveling merchant. Adelaide sometimes worried about her children's future, about what opportunities would be available to them in their remote life. But Kane always reminded her that they were giving their children something precious that most people never had. They were growing up free, unafraid, confident in themselves and their abilities. They knew how to survive in the wilderness, but also how to read and write and think critically. They were prepared for whatever life might bring them. On a bright summer day when Jacob was 16, Emma 13, and Thomas 11, Adelaide stood outside the cabin watching Kane teach the boys how to properly fell a tree while Emma practiced shooting cans off a fence rail. The girl had her father's steady hands and her mother's determination, rarely missing her target. "Not bad for a family that started with me half frozen in a cave," Adelaide said as Kane came to stand beside her, their work done for the moment. "Not bad at all," Kane agreed, slipping his arm around her waist and pulling her close. "Think you made the right choice staying with me instead of going back to civilization." Adelaide turned in his arms and looked up at him, at the gray in his hair now and the lines around his eyes, at the face she loved more than any other in the world. "It was the easiest choice I ever made," she said, "and I would make it again every single day." Kane kissed her then, tender and sweet, and Adelaide marveled at how after all these years, his kisses still had the power to make her feel like she was flying. This was what happiness looked like, she thought. Not wealth or status or any of the things society said were important. Just this. A good man, healthy children, a place to call home, and the freedom to live life on their own terms. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, and Adelaide and Kane grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They saw their children grow into adults, watched Jacob marry a girl from Central City and start his own family, saw Emma become a teacher who split her time between the mountains and town, witnessed Thomas take his fiddle and his gentle spirit out into the world to make music that brought joy to everyone who heard it. And through it all, through the triumphs and the sorrows, the good times and the lean, Adelaide and Kane remained constant to each other. They had both known loneliness and loss before they found each other, had both learned the hard way how precious real love was. They never took it for granted, never stopped being grateful for the storm that had brought them together. On a cool autumn evening 40 years after Adelaide had nearly died in that mountain pass, she and Kane sat on the porch of their much-expanded cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains that had been their home for so long. They were both in their 60s now, still strong but definitely showing the wear of years spent in hard country. Their children were all grown with families of their own, though they visited regularly, filling the cabin with grandchildren and noise and laughter. "You ever regret it?" Adelaide asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Giving up your solitary life for all of this?" Kane looked at her, and even after 40 years the love in his eyes took her breath away. "Not for a single second," he said firmly. "You gave me a life worth living, Adelaide. Before you, I was just surviving. After you, I started to actually live. No, I have no regrets at all." "Good," Adelaide said, leaning her head on his shoulder and feeling his arm come around her automatically. "Because I do not either. This life we built together, this family, this home. It is everything I never knew I wanted and more than I ever dreamed of having." They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Somewhere in the distance, an elk bugled, and closer by, they could hear the sound of the stream that ran near the cabin, the same stream where they had panned for gold in those early days of their marriage. "I love you, Kane Zimmerman," Adelaide said softly. "I have loved you since the day you pulled me from that cave and gave me a second chance at life." "And I love you, Adelaide Zimmerman," Kane replied, his voice rough with emotion even after all these years. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I thank God for that storm every single day of my life." They sat together as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life together that had exceeded their wildest dreams. The storm that had nearly killed Adelaide had instead given her everything she needed, had brought her to the man she was meant to love, had led her home in a way she never could have anticipated. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not the hardships they had faced or the challenges they had overcome, but the love they had found and nurtured and protected through all the years. That love had given them children and grandchildren, had filled their lives with purpose and meaning, had transformed Kane's lonely cabin into a true home. As Adelaide drifted off to sleep that night, wrapped in her husband's arms just as she had been for 40 years, she thought once more of that storm, of the cold and fear and desperate struggle to survive. She thought of how close she had come to giving up, to accepting death in that cave. And she thought of Kane's voice cutting through the darkness, of his strong hands lifting her to safety, of the warmth of his cabin and the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. She thought of their first kiss, their wedding day, the births of their children, and all the countless small moments in between that had woven together to create their life. The storm had trapped her, alone and dying in the mountain pass. But Kane had found her before the cold could take her. And in saving her life, he had given her so much more. He had given her love, family, purpose, and joy. He had given her a home and a future. He had given her everything. And Adelaide had given him the same in return, pulling him out of his own lonely existence and showing him that life was worth living, that love was real, that happiness was possible even after terrible loss and grief. They had saved each other in the end. And they had built something beautiful together, something that would last long after they were gone, living on in their children and grandchildren, in the stories told around campfires, in the cabin that would stand in the mountains for generations to come. The storm had been the beginning of their story, but their love had been the middle and the end, and everything that mattered. And as Adelaide slipped into peaceful sleep, she knew with absolute certainty that she would not change a single thing about the path that had led her here, to this man, to this life, to this perfect and complete happiness. The end.